August 19, 1944. East Prussia lay shrouded in gray mist, the air heavy with the scent of oil, tobacco, and exhaustion. Inside the underground command complex at Rastenburg, the Wolf's Lair, maps covered the walls like the arteries of a dying empire. Red pins marked what had once been the German front in France. Now, most of those pins were gone. At a long oak table beneath the dim yellow glow of electric lamps, General Oberst Alfred Jodl studied the reports from the Western Front. His officer stood silent, watching the thin trail of cigarette smoke curl up as he traced his finger along a line stretching from Normandy to the Seine River. 400 miles. That was the distance the Americans had advanced since D-Day. "They've gone too far," Jodl murmured at last. "No army can move that fast and sustain itself." His staff agreed. Every principle of military logistics said the same. An armored division on the move burned 150,000 gallons of fuel each day. Patton commanded 12 divisions, his Third Army surging through France like a storm of steel. The arithmetic was merciless. The Americans were operating 400 miles from their supply bases on the beaches. Fuel lines that long, German officers reasoned, could not hold. "Give it 2 days," said Major General Siegfried Westphal, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal von Rundstedt. "Their tanks will run dry, their trucks will stop, and their advance will collapse. Then we strike back." In Berlin, the High Command nodded in agreement. After all, the Wehrmacht had seen this before, in Russia, in North Africa, in Poland. Armies that outpaced their supplies always perished. The laws of physics and logistics were immutable. Even America's industrial might could not outrun them. But 125 miles away, in the dark of a French night, a low thunder began to rise from the west, not from artillery, but from engines. Engines by the thousands. On the bomb-scarred roads of Normandy, headlights flared to life, not in cautious military blackout, but blazing like a defiant river of light. Columns of trucks stretched from horizon to horizon, their engines growling in perfect rhythm. Painted on their sides in bold red circles was a simple insignia: Red Ball. Nearly 6,000 trucks were rolling east, carrying 12,500 tons of supplies every day. Fuel, ammunition, rations, spare parts, everything Patton's spearhead needed to keep moving. Behind each steering wheel sat a driver, most of them young, many of them African American, serving in a segregated army that had given them everything except equality. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to launch the most audacious logistics operation in military history, one that would outthink, outbuild, and outlast the German war machine itself. To the German mind, it was impossible. No army could sustain such consumption. No roads could handle such weight. No men could endure such pace. Yet, as the first convoys roared past the ruined French hedgerows, a new kind of warfare was being born, a war of movement powered by gasoline, driven by ordinary men who refused to stop. For the first time in history, logistics would not follow strategy. It would become strategy. And at its heart was a single, relentless artery of steel: the Red Ball Express. Dawn broke over the battered port of Cherbourg, a city half in ruins, half reborn. Cargo ships bobbed in the harbor, their decks stacked high with barrels of fuel, crates of rations, and artillery shells stamped "Made in Detroit." The port reeked of salt, diesel, and the raw pulse of war industry. In a commandeered French chateau overlooking the docks, Lieutenant Colonel Lauren Ayres of the Motor Transport Service stood before a wall-sized map. Dozens of red strings stretched from the beaches to Patton's forward positions, tangled, broken, and inefficient. The officers around him were grim. The numbers made no sense. Patton's Third Army was burning fuel faster than any force in history. The existing supply system, depots, scheduled convoys, and railway links, was collapsing under the strain. "Gentlemen," Ayers said, tapping the map with a ruler, "if we keep using traditional logistics, Patton stops within 48 hours. So we won't." The room fell silent. "We're going to build a one-way highway," he continued, voice steady but defiant, "from Cherbourg to Chartres, from the beaches to the front. Every truck will run 20 hours out of every 24. No stops except for fuel and breakdowns. No detours. No delays. We'll move 12,500 tons daily, minimum." He looked at the stunned faces before him. "We're going to do the impossible," he said quietly, "and we'll call it the Red Ball Express." In railroad slang, a red ball was a high-priority freight, cargo that took precedence over everything else. Now the term would define the lifeline of the Allied armies.
Within 36 hours, the first route was operational. 2 parallel highways were designated, one for eastbound loaded trucks, one for westbound empties returning to reload. Headlights were ordered to stay on at all times, day and night, violating every rule of military blackout discipline. Convoys would run at 5-minute intervals, maintaining 35 miles per hour, with no halts except at refueling points spaced every 25 miles. It was audacity disguised as simplicity, and it worked. By the evening of August 26, 1944, the first convoy, the 3916th Quartermaster Truck Company, rolled out of Cherbourg, each GMC CCKW 2.5-ton truck loaded with 105mm artillery shells bound for the front. The men driving those trucks were not frontline soldiers. They were logisticians, mechanics, and drivers, many barely out of training. And 3 out of every 4 were African American, members of segregated units who, despite being denied combat roles, were now tasked with keeping the most powerful army on earth alive. They painted slogans on their trucks with chalk and mud. Hitler's gas station, Patton's blood bank, Detroit to Berlin Express. Each convoy became its own microcosm of America. Engines from Michigan, tires from Ohio, fuel from Texas, and drivers from every corner of the country, rolling through liberated France with a mission that few historians would ever see, but without which the war would grind to a halt. One sergeant later recalled, "We weren't heroes with rifles. Our weapon was the wheel. Our battlefield was the road." The Red Ball Express operated like a living organism, improvising, adapting, never sleeping. Mobile repair teams were stationed every 50 miles, armed with spare parts and wrenches instead of rifles. Broken-down trucks were pushed off the road within 15 minutes, their engines cannibalized to keep others moving. If a driver slowed below 25 miles per hour, military police pulled him from the convoy. Speed wasn't optional. It was survival. The Germans, watching from observation posts, could hardly believe what they saw. Their reports described a spectacle beyond comprehension. Continuous vehicle columns, headlights visible for 20 kilometers. No spacing, no camouflage. Estimate 1,000 vehicles per hour. Americans disregard all military precaution. They were right, and that was the point. Where the Wehrmacht relied on precision and secrecy, the Americans relied on volume, a system so massive that even inefficiency became irrelevant. By the end of its first week, the Red Ball Express had delivered 90,000 tons of supplies, averaging nearly 13,000 tons per day, more than the entire German 7th Army received in a month. Fuel dumps appeared like mirages along the route. Vast fields of 55-gallon drums stacked in pyramids, guarded by sentries and shadowed by bombers overhead. Each day, 300,000 gallons of gasoline were consumed by the trucks themselves, a figure so absurd that German analysts dismissed it as propaganda. But the numbers were real, and they were growing. For every gallon the Red Ball burned, it delivered 10 more to the front. For every truck that broke down, 2 more took its place.
American industry had reached across an ocean and turned the roads of France into conveyor belts of victory. The GMC Deuce and a Half, the humble 2.5-ton truck, became the beating heart of Patton's advance. Its 6x6 drive could climb hills, ford streams, and run for 200 miles without rest. Soldiers called it the truck that won the war. And perhaps they were right. By September 1st, convoys were moving at a rate that defied even American planners. 5,000 trucks on the road at any given moment. Each one carrying food, ammunition, medical supplies, and above all, fuel. Fuel to keep tanks rolling, planes flying, and armies advancing. Fuel that would carry Patton's Third Army not just to Paris, but to the very borders of Germany. To the Germans, it was madness. To the Americans, it was Tuesday. Night in northern France. The rain came sideways, cutting through the fog and bouncing off the windshields of 1,000 trucks. Engines howled into the dark, their headlights carving twin rivers of light down mud-choked roads that once carried German armor. Now they carried something more powerful: momentum. Each truck bore the weight of victory: 5 tons of gasoline, ammunition, food, or spare parts. Each driver bore the weight of history. And most of those drivers were young men who, just months earlier, had never left home. They came from Chicago, Birmingham, and Harlem. Farmers, mechanics, and bus drivers turned soldiers behind the wheel. Many wore the same tired insignia, the white star of the U.S. Army, and on their shoulders the quiet burden of segregation. They were the African-American drivers of the Red Ball Express, the lifeline of an army that still wouldn't let them eat in the same mess halls as the men they supplied. Yet every night they climbed into their trucks, gripped the steering wheel, and drove straight into chaos. The rules were simple, brutal, and absolute. No stopping, no lights off, no turning back. Convoys moved like veins of fire, one truck every 30 seconds, running 35 miles per hour no matter the weather, no matter the shelling. Breakdowns were fixed on the roadside in minutes. Engines swapped by torchlight, tires replaced while artillery thundered miles ahead. If a truck couldn't move, it was pushed into a ditch and stripped for parts. The road could never stop, not for death, not for wreckage, not for anything. Private Booker T. Washington once drove his truck while the brakes burned red hot, hauling medical supplies for a field hospital near Metz. When flames licked through the floorboards, he didn't stop. He drove until the truck caught fire, jumped free at the gates, and watched it explode behind him. The supplies saved dozens of wounded soldiers. He said later, it wasn't heroism, it was the job. Every 50 miles, mobile maintenance crews waited with spare engines, tools, and strong coffee. They worked under floodlights, wrenches in one hand and carbines in the other. The Germans had left mines and snipers along the routes, but the convoys rolled on. When a bridge was blown, engineers built a new one overnight from the rubble of French villages. Where Germans calculated 6 weeks for repairs, Americans did it in 14 hours. A Red Ball convoy was a thing of madness and beauty, a continuous motion of roaring steel, thunderous engines, and men running on adrenaline and benzodrine. They drove for 72 hours straight, hallucinating from exhaustion. Some sang to stay awake, others tied belts around their chests to keep from slumping forward at the wheel. Accidents were constant. Trucks skidded into craters, flipped into rivers, burned on the roadside. By the time the operation ended, over 300 drivers were dead. But the convoys never stopped. To the German soldiers huddled in the hedgerows, the sound was like thunder that never ended. They called it the rolling storm. Every night, they heard the same endless drone, the growl of engines that meant more American fuel, more ammunition, more tanks coming their way. One prisoner later told his interrogators, "We heard your trucks and knew the war was lost. You could supply faster than we could destroy." The Red Ball Express became more than logistics. It became psychological warfare. The Germans fired artillery at the convoys, but it hardly mattered. For every truck destroyed, 10 more appeared. They had never faced an enemy who measured war not in bullets, but in tons per day. German intelligence officers tried to make sense of it. Reports described something that defied all military doctrine. The Americans ignored discipline, procedure, camouflage. They drive through the night with headlights blazing, in columns that stretch beyond sight. They repair nothing, they replace everything. They burn more fuel delivering fuel than we allocate to an entire division. It is not war, it is industrial flood. They were right. The Red Ball Express wasn't elegant or efficient or even safe. It was something new, war by abundance. In Berlin, General Walter Model studied the reports and muttered to his staff, "We are not fighting an army, we are fighting a civilization." Each day, the convoys moved 12,500 tons of supplies, fuel for tanks, rations for soldiers, ammunition for artillery that fired without restraint. American gunners could now shell targets for hours. The Germans, rationed to a handful of shells per day, could only listen to the rain of steel. During the siege of Metz, the U.S. artillery fired 100,000 shells in 24 hours, and the Red Ball Express delivered every single round. By September 5, 1944, 5,000 trucks were on the road at any given moment. They traveled 700 miles round trip, burning 300,000 gallons of gasoline daily just to keep moving. And yet, fuel never ran short. The secret lay beneath the waves. A parallel miracle, Operation Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, was pumping Allied fuel through undersea pipes from England to France. The Germans never discovered it. Together, the Red Ball Express and Pluto created a machine of perpetual motion, a war fueled by engineering and imagination. In Berlin, General Walter Model studied the reports and muttered to his staff, "We are not fighting an army, we are fighting a civilization." Each day, the convoys moved 12,500 tons of supplies, fuel for tanks, rations for soldiers, ammunition for artillery that fired without restraint. American gunners could now shell targets for hours. The Germans, rationed to a handful of shells per day, could only listen to the rain of steel. During the siege of Metz, the U.S. artillery fired 100,000 shells in 24 hours, and the Red Ball Express delivered every single round. By September 5, 1944, 5,000 trucks were on the road at any given moment. They traveled 700 miles round trip, burning 300,000 gallons of gasoline daily just to keep moving. And yet, fuel never ran short. The secret lay beneath the waves. A parallel miracle, Operation Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, was pumping Allied fuel through undersea pipes from England to France. The Germans never discovered it. Together, the Red Ball Express and Pluto created a machine of perpetual motion, a war fueled by engineering and imagination. Inside those trucks, the men turned endurance into defiance. They joked that their convoy was the fastest-moving damn thing in Europe. They gave children chocolate and cigarettes at every stop, winning hearts faster than any propaganda leaflet could. They shared their food, their fuel, their laughter, small rebellions of kindness that followed in the wake of destruction. To the French who watched the endless lines of olive-drab trucks roll by, it was like watching America itself cross their land, loud, reckless, generous, unstoppable. For a continent starved under occupation, the sight of abundance was liberation in motion. By the first week of September, the Red Ball Express had achieved the impossible.
Patton's tanks, which the Germans predicted would halt in 2 days, had crossed the Seine in 3 and reached the German border in less than a month. Paris was free. Fuel flowed, food arrived, ammunition thundered, all because a few thousand men refused to stop driving. When Patton was told of the operation, he simply said, "My men can fight, my tanks can move, because you keep them fed." And with that, the Red Ball Express became legend. It was the engine of victory, roaring through the heart of a dying empire, proving that in modern war, the road could be mightier than the gun. By early September 1944, the German High Command finally began to understand that the war had entered a new phase, one that their doctrine, their training, and their pride had never prepared them for. From East Prussia, General Oberst Alfred Jodl stared at fresh intelligence reports that seemed more like fever dreams than facts. 5,000 American trucks on the road at once. Headlights blazing through the night. Convoys stretching farther than the eye could see, each hauling 5 tons of fuel and ammunition, moving at speeds that violated every rule of logistics.
The German staff officers exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't blitzkrieg. This was something else, a force of industry in motion, a civilization that had transformed its factories into an army. In Liege, German reconnaissance planes photographed the French countryside. The pictures returned with impossible details. Endless columns of olive-drab vehicles, fuel depots the size of small towns, bridges repaired overnight. "Amerikanische Verschwendung," one officer whispered, "American waste." But there was fear in his voice. They saw convoys roaring through villages without blackout discipline, burning fuel as if the wells of the world were theirs. They saw trucks running 20 hours a day, maintenance crews performing miracles with wrenches instead of rifles. The Germans could not comprehend how the system didn't collapse under its own excess. In Berlin, Field Marshal Walter Model read the reports aloud to his staff. "They make no effort to hide because they do not fear us. They waste resources because they have endless resources. We are not facing a superior army. We are facing a superior civilization." German soldiers along the front began to hear the Red Ball Express before they saw it. The low, distant growl of engines echoed across the night, a constant mechanical heartbeat that haunted their sleep. Even when no trucks were near, they swore they could still hear the rumble, phantom convoys rolling endlessly through their dreams. Psychological warfare by accident. Captured Wehrmacht officers admitted later that morale collapsed not from Allied gunfire, but from the sound of American abundance. They had 3 bullets per rifle, while the Americans seemed to have an ocean of ammunition. Every explosion, every shell, every tank rolling forward reminded them that they were fighting a nation that had turned logistics into a weapon. Meanwhile, the convoys grew faster, louder, and more relentless. The Red Ball Express was now delivering more than 13,000 tons of supplies every day. Its own consumption was staggering, 300,000 gallons of gasoline daily just to feed itself. German analysts scoffed. "It is unsustainable," they said. "No army can waste that much and survive." But the Americans did not care about sustainability. They cared about momentum. Where the Wehrmacht built for efficiency, the Americans built for scale. If something broke, they replaced it. If a bridge fell, they built a new one before dawn. If a truck burned, 10 more took its place. In one French village, German spotters reported a sight that left their officers speechless. Headlights stretched in a continuous ribbon over the horizon. Vehicles spaced only 30 seconds apart, day and night with no pause. General Edgar Feuchtinger of the 21st Panzer Division sent a frantic message to Army Group B headquarters. Enemy operates a supply system beyond comprehension. They move like a factory conveyor. We fight soldiers, they fight with machines. By now, even generals who had once mocked American soldiers as mechanical cowards began to realize the terrible truth. Machines, when built in sufficient numbers, do not tire. Machines do not need rest. And America had built more of them than the world had ever seen. Every German counterattack that September faltered for the same reason: fuel. Their tanks were hungry beasts that could no longer be fed. The Panthers and Tigers that once terrified Allied crews now sat abandoned on the roadside, out of gas. Meanwhile, the Shermans, supplied by the Red Ball's endless river of fuel, rolled on. Field Marshal von Rundstedt received a desperate proposal from one of his staff officers. We should bomb their roads, disrupt their convoys. Rundstedt laughed bitterly. With what? The Luftwaffe? We no longer have the skies. Destroy 1,000 of their trucks, they will replace them in a week. Destroy 10,000, and they will build 20. How do you stop an army that manufactures its own reinforcements? The German war machine had been designed for short, sharp campaigns, lightning wars fueled by precision and terror. But now they faced a kind of warfare that no general in Europe had foreseen: war by arithmetic. Every calculation they made was wrong because the Americans rewrote the math. An armored division consumed 150,000 gallons a day? Then they sent 300,000. A truck could last 30,000 miles before failure? Then they built 10 for every one they lost. Every problem was solved not with elegance, but with overwhelming quantity. To the Germans, this seemed insane. To the Americans, it was normal. In the cafes of liberated France, locals gathered along the highways to watch the convoys thunder past. Children waved, drivers tossed them chocolate, gum, and cigarettes. The generosity stunned people who had survived years of Nazi rationing. To them, the Red Ball Express wasn't just a supply line. It was a symbol of freedom in motion, an empire of abundance rolling across the land. French farmers joked that the Americans brought more food in a week than the Germans had left in 4 years. And they weren't wrong. Each truck carried not just fuel and bullets, but hope. The tangible proof that the war was turning, that liberation was real, that the future had wheels and an engine. In late September, German intelligence intercepted a coded transmission from the American Third Army. Supplies arriving faster than consumption rate. Situation excellent. To the Germans, that sentence was incomprehensible. How could any army consume less than it received while advancing hundreds of miles? For the first time, the Wehrmacht faced an enemy who did not fear distance, who did not slow down, who could replace losses faster than war could inflict them. It was the end of an old world and the beginning of a new one. By mid-September 1944, the Red Ball Express had become the single most vital artery of the Allied war effort, and its men the beating heart that kept it alive. But every mile earned in speed came at a price written in sweat, exhaustion, and blood. The drivers were young, most barely 20 years old, and the majority of them were African American soldiers serving in segregated units. They had been told they were not fit for combat, yet they now carried the war itself on their backs. Every shell, every bullet, every drop of gasoline that reached the front had passed through their hands. They slept in bursts of 20 minutes on the side of the road, helmets tilted over their faces, engines idling beside them like beasts that refused to rest. They ate cold rations from tin cans, drank coffee thick as mud, and swallowed Benzedrine tablets to stay awake for 72 hours straight. They joked that their convoy was the longest foxhole in Europe because they lived and fought entirely on the move. Accidents were constant. The roads were narrow, cratered, and slick with rain. When trucks overturned, other drivers stopped only long enough to pull their comrades free before the column swallowed them again. The wounded were taken to makeshift aid stations. The dead were left until daylight. One survivor later wrote, "The road took everything but our will." Still, morale held. They created their own world on the highway, an unwritten brotherhood forged by fatigue and defiance. Each truck carried a nickname painted in grease or chalk. Mississippi Queen, No Sleep Till Berlin, Hitler's gas station. The convoys were alive with banter over open radios, the laughter of men who knew the odds and refused to care. In the cab of a GMC Deuce and a Half, two soldiers traded stories between gears. "Think the Germans can hear us?" one shouted. "Hope so," came the reply. "Let 'em know who's coming." And in the dark, they kept coming. Every day, thousands of these men risked more than enemy fire. They faced fatigue so deep it blurred reality. They hallucinated phantom lights in the fog, ghost convoys that weren't there. Engines exploded, tires shredded by shrapnel rolled smoking into the ditches. By the operation's end, more than 300 drivers were dead and thousands more injured. But the red ball never stopped, not for weather, not for exhaustion, not even for death. Mechanics worked beside the roads with blowtorches and wrenches, silhouetted by the glow of burning fuel dumps. Engines were swapped in 45 minutes, transmissions in half an hour. They used parts scavenged from wrecks, welded together frames that should have been junk, and sent them back into the line. American efficiency wasn't a miracle. It was endurance made mechanical. To the German observers who watched from the hedgerows, this chaos looked like madness. They were trained to worship order and procedure. The Americans worshipped results. If the Germans built clockwork, the Americans built hurricanes. One captured German colonel said later, "They broke every rule of war and made it work. They made disorder efficient." The secret lay in trust. Officers gave orders, but the men made decisions. Sergeants rerouted convoys on instinct. Corporals rebuilt bridges without permission. Every soldier acted like a commander because no one had time to wait for authority. It was the opposite of the rigid hierarchy that defined the Wehrmacht, and it terrified them. The Red Ball Express wasn't just moving supplies, it was demonstrating a new kind of warfare, decentralized, adaptive, and unstoppable. By the end of September, the operation had consumed 5,000 trucks, 10,000 tires, and more than 57 million gallons of fuel. Each day, it carried the lifeblood of the Allied armies across a shattered continent. To the man behind the wheel, it was simple. If they stopped, someone at the front would die. General Eisenhower visited the Red Ball route that month. He watched convoys thunder past for nearly half an hour without a single break. Turning to his aide, he said quietly, "These men are winning the war as surely as any rifleman." For many of those drivers, those words were the first real recognition they had ever received. They kept driving through the rains of October, through flooded roads and German artillery fire. When bridges collapsed, they built new ones from wreckage. When fuel depots ran low, they drained trucks to fill tanks. The Red Ball Express adapted to every crisis, splitting into new routes, creating way stations, inventing systems faster than they could be written down. German engineers, astonished by the speed of reconstruction, reported, "They build faster than we can destroy." They were right. At the Moselle River, A bridge the Germans had estimated would take 6 weeks to rebuild was replaced by American engineers in 14 hours. Convoys resumed before sunrise, rolling across a structure still warm from the welding torches. Every statistic told the same story. In 82 days, the Red Ball Express delivered over 400,000 tons of supplies, enough to feed, fuel, and arm an army that stretched from Normandy to the German frontier. Patton's Third Army advanced faster than any force in modern history, covering 60 miles in a single day because its fuel was already waiting when it arrived. The Red Ball Express was no longer a supply line. It was a living symbol of American determination. It was the proof that industrial democracy could outfight fascist precision, that improvisation could defeat ideology. One German general, captured later, summarized it best. "We lost not to your weapons, but to your wheels." For the men who drove those wheels, the praise came too late. When the Red Ball finally shut down in November 1944, most of its drivers were reassigned quietly, their names forgotten in official reports. But the roads of France still bore the scars of their passage, grooves carved by tires that never stopped, a reminder that victory had a price measured not in glory but in miles. When the guns finally fell silent and the smoke cleared over Europe, the Red Ball Express disappeared as quickly as it had been born. The convoys halted, the signs came down, and the endless river of trucks drained back into the sea of history. But the echo of their engines never truly stopped. It lived on, in the freedom they delivered, in the doctrine they rewrote, and in the quiet pride of the men who proved that courage could drive on 4 wheels. November 16, 1944. The final convoy rolled east from Cherbourg under a gray, wind-bitten sky. Mud splattered across its headlights, and the familiar red circle on its door was half washed away by rain. Inside, 2 exhausted soldiers sat in silence, the road humming beneath them like a heartbeat fading into memory. They had no medals waiting, no parades, no songs written in their honor. But they knew something the world hadn't yet learned. They had changed the course of the war. In 82 days, the Red Ball Express had carried over 412,000 tons of supplies, traveled more than 122 million ton miles, and burned 57 million gallons of fuel. It had consumed itself to keep the Allied advance alive, destroying 5,000 trucks and wearing out 180,000 tires, yet never once failing in its mission. It had supplied an army faster than physics said was possible. And it had done all this not through perfection, but through will. The German generals, now prisoners of war, studied the reports in disbelief. They read the tonnage figures and fuel consumption rates as though they were reading science fiction. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring shook his head and said simply, "We prepared for your tanks and your planes. We never prepared for your trucks." Another officer was more direct. "You defeated us with factories, not soldiers." To the Germans, the Red Ball Express represented everything they had never understood about America. Improvisation over doctrine, chaos over control, abundance over efficiency. But the true legacy of the Red Ball Express wasn't written in steel or oil. It was written in the hearts of the men who drove it, the 23,000 African American soldiers who proved that equality could not be denied by prejudice or policy. They had been given the most dangerous, exhausting job in the war, and they had turned it into victory. When Eisenhower saw them at work, covered in dust and grease, he told his aide, "These men are winning the war as surely as any combat division." And he was right. 3 years later, the United States Army would begin desegregation, a transformation rooted in the undeniable proof that black soldiers had carried the war on their shoulders, literally, mile after mile.
For those men, the Red Ball Express was their battlefield. Every gallon of fuel they delivered was a bullet in the fight not only against fascism, but against the walls of their own country's injustice. They had driven through discrimination and danger, and by the end, they had driven straight into history. When the war ended, the drivers went home, to cities and small towns that hardly knew their names. But many of them carried something back with them besides scars and memories. They carried knowledge. They had operated the largest transportation network the world had ever seen. And with that experience, they built something new, a modern America.
Those veterans became truckers, mechanics, and engineers. They founded the companies that would define post-war logistics: Yellow Freight, Roadway, Consolidated Freightways. They designed the blueprint for the interstate highway system. The Red Ball Express had not only supplied a war, it had built the foundation for an economy. In the decades that followed, the lessons of the Red Ball Express spread far beyond the battlefields of France. Every modern army studied its model. Every logistics officer learned its mantra: keep them moving. The operation had rewritten the playbook of warfare. It proved that in the industrial age, victory did not belong to the side with the most tanks or the best generals, but to the side that could deliver. As one German general later admitted, amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. The Americans talked trucks, and they won. 50 years later, on a calm summer morning in 1994, veterans of the Red Ball Express gathered in Washington, D.C. for a memorial ceremony. Many of them were old now, their hands unsteady, their hair white as the clouds drifting above the Capitol. But when the sound of truck engines echoed through hidden speakers, more than one man closed his eyes and smiled. In the National Postal Museum, the U.S. Postal Service unveiled a commemorative stamp. It showed a single GMC truck on a war-torn French road, headlights cutting through the night, a red circle on its door glowing like a wound and a promise. Below it, the words read, "The Red Ball Express, 1944. The crowd rose in applause. No medals, no guns, no uniforms, just the sound of hands clapping for men who had once been invisible and whose engines had carried freedom across a continent. Today, along the quiet highways of Normandy, you can still see traces of their road, faint grooves in the earth, patches of asphalt reclaimed by grass. Sometimes, if the wind is right, you can almost hear the echo of those convoys. The roar of 6,000 engines, the grind of tires on stone, the rhythm of determination that never stopped. That was the sound of democracy on the move. That was the music of victory. The Red Ball Express proved one timeless truth: that courage isn't always measured by who holds the rifle. Sometimes it's measured by who keeps the engine running. Epilogue. The Red Ball Express was not perfect. It was wasteful, chaotic, dangerous. But it worked. It carried freedom at 35 miles per hour through a continent at war. It transformed supply into strategy, logistics into legend. And when the German generals finally signed their surrender in May 1945, they did so not just to tanks or bombers, but to the men who drove trucks through fire and fatigue until the world itself began to move again. For in that roaring, rolling miracle of dust and steel, one truth was proven beyond doubt. In modern war, the road to victory is paved with courage and driven by the men who never stop. The engines have long fallen silent, but their echo still rumbles through history, a reminder that victory isn't always won by those who fire the shots, but by those who keep the world moving forward. The Red Ball Express was more than a convoy. It was the heartbeat of freedom, pounding down the broken roads of Europe at 35 miles an hour. If this story moved you, don't let it fade into the dust of forgotten roads. Subscribe to the channel, share this video, and help us keep these untold stories alive. Because history isn't just something we remember, it's something we drive forward together. This is WW2 War Room, where the past still speaks and the engines of history never stop.